Hi, I'm Eduardo Oliveira of O Contato Podcast. If you are part of our Brazilian audience, you already know me, you know Vinicius Martins and Gustavo Cornaccioni. If you are an international viewer, you probably don't know us because we don't produce content in other languages, at least not until now. But this is a very special moment because this special episode is our first international interview. Okay, that's why we're going to speak in English with you today because our interviewee, I'm sorry, doesn't speak Portuguese. Okay, our interviewee today is a very famous author on UFO and UAP topics, Chris Aubeck. And to talk to him, I will have my friend Gustavo Cornaccioni here. So I'm just going to bring them up to the screen and I'll let them introduce themselves. Okay.
Hi, Chris.
Welcome.
Hi.
Nice to meet you.
So, Chris, it's a very important moment for us because it's our first international interview, and it's a very nice moment also because we're finally talking to you after some time, texting and reading about your views, your career. So, thank you for accepting our invitation.
Not at all. I hope I can come back many times when I start publishing books in Brazilian Portuguese, which is one of my aims, one of my objectives right now.
We can help you with that, maybe. I don't know. Maybe we can. I don't, Gustavo, could we help him, or shouldn't we talk about it in public at least?
I think we should help him, but quietly.
Okay. So, Gustavo, could you begin with our first round of questions? Okay, so our interview is going to be uh, constructed in different rounds of questions, and each round will have a different topic. At least that's how we scripted it. Usually, when we script interviews, they go completely different than what we had planned, and it becomes much more interesting than what we originally thought it would be. So it's actually a good thing. But we plan different topics to talk to you today, and I would like Gustavo to begin with questions about you and your career.
Yes, first of all, Chris, thank you very much for accepting our invitation. It's a great honor to talk to you. So, the first part of this interview, of this talk, I want you to introduce yourself to our audience here in Brazil. So I would like to ask to begin if you could tell us a little bit about yourself, where you were born, and what led you to study UFOs.
Okay, well, I was born in London in 1971, and I became interested in the topic of UFOs at the age of 13 or 14 when I accidentally found an old copy of one of Eric von Daniken's books, his second book, in fact, called in English Return to the Stars. And I became fascinated with the topic of ancient aliens or ancient astronauts, as we normally said at that time. And it changed my perspective of history, folklore, mythology, and humanity. And I spent the next 6 years until I was, 18, 19, researching these topics in my free time. Sometimes I didn't even go to school. I'd sit in the university library and look through all of the academic journals and scientific magazines, looking for information to support or to reject Eric von Daniken's hypotheses. And when I was 18, actually, I went to the United States, where I spent several days with a writer called Lana Cantrell, who had written a very large book, 1,000 pages, called The Greatest Story Never Told, all about the degeneration of humanity from a point in antiquity when we had, she says, green skin and pointed ears, and we flew around in fantastic cars. Then I spent 2 weeks in the house of a man called Vaughan Green, who was a writer. He has died now, but he was a writer on the subject of little Japanese statuettes called dogu, which are very famous. They're thousands of years old, and they look like they're wearing space costumes, space suits with their helmets or visors. So I started my life in the UFO community by looking at ancient aliens. And then when I was 19, I came to Spain, where I am now, just as a kind of adventure to travel the world. And I never went home. Well, I go home to visit occasionally, but I've been living in Spain since then. And in this period of time, in the last 34 years, I have published, I think, 7 books on the subject of UFOs and similar things, particularly focusing on the history of this field. I'm interested in how it all began, how our ancestors interpreted strange phenomena they saw in the sky, but also I'm interested in how ufology began as a field. In the year 2003, I started an organization online called Magonia Exchange, where we have about 160 members. It depends on the period, but normally about 160 members from different countries. And we share information that would be lost normally, because maybe we have it in boxes and in cupboards or under the bed or in the attic. Researchers, UFO investigators often have a lot of information that they never share. And we send it to each other. And we also do searches of digital libraries around the world. And over the last 22 years, we've collected around 60,000 items. That's 60,000 articles, letters, forgotten books and pictures. And so it's probably the biggest archive of UFO material in the world. Then last year, I published a book about Charles Fort, the great pioneer who introduced the world to UFOs and strange phenomena. And what I did was to collect all of his letters, the letters that he wrote to newspapers, and I put them all together in the same volume for the first time. And it's a very interesting thing. And I've published many books and done many conferences. One of my co-authors is better known to Brazilian researchers or people interested in this field, Jacques Vallée, the French astronomer. We wrote a book together called Wonders in the Sky, which we published in 2010. And then we made a second edition around the year 2015, I believe it was. And we've collaborated on many projects together. And I have a lot of books to publish this year. This year is going to be my most prolific year, because I'm also translating old books from the 19th century into English, into Spanish, and hopefully into Portuguese. That's basically who I am.
Yeah, hopefully we'll be able to read in Portuguese some of your work. You have a background in linguistics and folklore, right?
That's right. Yeah, I've always been fascinated by folklore. I've always been interested. The word folklore, at least in Spanish, is confused with other words that begin with folk, like folk dancing and folk costumes and so on. But really, folklore, of course, lore refers to legends and stories. So it's the stories of the people. And then as a teacher myself, as an English teacher, I'm very interested in looking into the language that we use to express our most unusual experiences and dreams and so on. So I'm interested in the etymology of many words and expressions. And this led me to publish a book 2 years ago called Sources, which looks at the origin of flying saucers in the 1940s, which is very much connected to language.
Yes, I would like to ask you, how did that background influence the way you investigate these stories? Not just UFO stories. You mentioned Charles Fort. We usually mention him in our episodes because he was one of the pioneers of this field, and many people in Brazil, at least, don't know about his work. We started mentioning him in an episode about John Keel, and John Keel considered himself a Fortean, and he inspired himself a lot. At least most of his work was inspired by the work of Charles Fort. So, how did this academic background in these fields influence the way a researcher looks at these stories?
Well, I'm interested in finding patterns, in repetitions in the evidence. I'm looking for any links between stories and cases from different parts of the world and how people have interpreted this. And when you look at things etymologically, linguistically, and you don't treat it simply as a series of sightings or cases, you look at it also as if it were literature. You can see patterns in the data that you would not normally see. When you turn UFO sightings into an Excel sheet or into a simple database of numbers and basic facts, you lose a lot of the information about who the witnesses were, how they described what they saw. So I don't like using simplistic databases. I like using the actual text itself. So to give you an example, there's a case in Jacques Vallée's book, Passport to Magonia, where he publishes quite a large catalogue of sightings over time, a few hundred, I believe. And one of the cases involves a man who is in the countryside. He sees some lights in a field. He has to cross over a small river. He approaches the aliens. All kinds of things happen. But then I realized that this story is exactly the same as one that appears in a book about fairies and elves and folkloric creatures, published in the year 1909 by a man called Evans Wentz, who was a folklorist who devoted his life to collecting stories about fairies in Ireland and Wales and Scotland. In any case, I realized that the witness in this UFO case had simply stolen, he had taken this basic story from a book about folklore, and he had updated it with aliens and spaceships, but it's exactly the same story. And that's interesting, and that kind of discovery you don't make if you only look at an Excel sheet or a simple database. So looking at the language used reveals a lot about the origins of things. For example, 2 years ago, I published this book called Saucers, like flying saucers, about Kenneth Arnold's famous sighting on the 24th of June, 1947. And when I got all of his testimonies together, all of the statements that he made to journalists or privately, I realized that he didn't see an object that was round at all. That's not what he saw. He saw something that looked more like a disc. Sorry, a disc, no, I mean a moon shape, like a crescent, approximately. In fact, he compared it originally to a bat, like a bat. But this had been lost in the press because the expression flying saucer wasn't invented at that moment. This is something that's quite important. It's a discovery I made about 27 years ago, I think, that the expression flying saucer was invented around the year 1880. So that's it's like 60 years or more before Kenneth Arnold's sighting. And it was invented for sport, because at that time in America, in North America and other parts of the world, shooting was very important. It was a very important sport, like tennis and football would be today. And they invented the expression flying saucer. And then this word survived 60 years until when Kenneth Arnold reported what he saw to the press, journalists decided it would be very funny to invent the expression flying saucer or reinvent it to give the impression that he'd seen something similar to what they saw in the sport. So that book, what it does, it shows how the expression flying saucer originated as a mistake or as a joke, but then became the dominant symbol of ufology. So if you buy a book on UFOs today, you will see the basic shape of a disc, but this really originated as an error, as a joke, in fact. So this kind of thing is interesting to me as someone interested in linguistics. Linguistics gives you a perspective that only science or only history wouldn't be able to give you.
Correct me if I'm wrong. These flying saucers from the 18s, they were made of clay, right?
That's right. Yeah.
Yeah, and they had the shape. It looks like the UFOs. That's it.
Totally. Yeah. Well, it's not that the UFOs that they look like UFOs. It's because before June 1947, UFOs did not look like discs. That's the question. In fact, what I do in the introduction to my book is I show that it's not correct that UFOs, even today, look like discs. Every study of the different kinds of UFOs that are seen regularly show that the disc shape is about 3%. 3% of cases, 97% of cases do not look like this flying disc. But we have adopted it culturally to represent UFOs. Let me show you. A few months ago, well, actually, I'll show you something interesting. So this is the book that I published. I don't have a copy with me because I'm actually moving to a different town now. So a lot of my things are in boxes. But this is the book that I published. This is the Spanish version. And here you can see the objects that Kenneth Arnold truly saw, but then the press, the journalists decided it was funnier to call it a flying saucer. But then a few months ago, I managed to buy an original flying saucer. And this here, it was very difficult to get one. This is actually the original flying saucer. This is from around the year 1880. So we're talking about 140 years ago, 145 years ago. And this is a flying saucer. That is what they look like. And people used to use these constantly. In fact, because it was the most important sport for a period of time, everybody was firing these through the sky constantly. And then this had an interesting effect because science fiction at that time was just developing. And the idea of extraterrestrials traveling around in spaceships was just developing. And we're talking about the 1880s. And interestingly, this, I'm going to show you, this book here, okay, is called Bellona's Husband. It took me 23 years to find this book, and I found it finally, and I spent like 250 euros on it. What this is, it's the first piece of science fiction that describes alien spaceships as flying saucers, and it describes them perfectly. It says that in all the solar system, extraterrestrials travel in flying discs, and it's the best kind of transportation to reach the sky, etc. Why? Well, because this was published at the time when the flying saucers were very popular. So it made sense. It was logical to make extraterrestrial ships disc-shaped. So that's the first. And what I'm doing now, I've translated this novel into Spanish, and I'd like to translate it into Portuguese, so people can see where the idea of flying saucers originated. And the last point I'll mention on this subject is when I published my book, I was contacted by a representative of the Oxford English Dictionary, who said, wow, now that you've discovered the origin of this expression, in the next edition of the dictionary, we're going to change the information about it. So it's had some impact.
If we going to start to talk about your books, I would like to ask, in Wonders in the Sky, you and Jacques Vallée explore UFO cases from antiquity, right? What was the most intriguing case you found?
Mm-hmm. Well, we found many very interesting cases. It's very difficult to say which one I like the most. We spent a few years looking for the best historical cases available. The problem since the 1940s is that so many people have published articles and books containing fake UFO cases that we spent a long time just trying to work out which ones were fake. Finally, we found about 500 that we could more or less say were true, and we tried to find the origin of these. Now, some of the medieval cases are very interesting, sometimes related to strange lights that come down from the sky, but then return to the sky, which is extremely interesting. There's no obvious explanation for a light that comes down and then goes back up again. I'll tell you about, there's a mystic, a woman who was born in the 17th century. Her name was Jane Lead. She lived in London, and she kept a diary. And in her diary, she's constantly talking about seeing strange objects flying in the sky. There's even a drawing by her, which looks very impressive. It looks very similar to a spaceship, like a big eye. And she gave everything a very mystical interpretation. But the most interesting thing for me is that sometimes she felt that she was transported to these objects in the sky, like as if they were stars or planets or something. And she would call the beginning of those diary entries a transportation or a transport. And so she would feel that she was with these interesting beings, these angelic or mysterious religious creatures, and they would talk to her, and then they would return her to her bedroom. And many of the details that she tells, are very, very similar to what modern abduction stories involve. The idea of a bedroom visitation, it takes you to another place. She even comes into contact with children and babies, which is exactly what abductees talk about in their witness statements, quite often under hypnosis. So what this means is difficult to say. There are many interpretations, of course. You could say, well, the human imagination goes in the same direction. It doesn't matter if it's the 17th century, 18th century, 20th century. Humans imagine the same kind of things. You could interpret it as a kind of archetypal experience. So maybe these are ideas that are present in the human mind that manifest in dreams or fantasies. Or you could interpret it as something more physical, the idea that maybe she had contact with the same beings and visitors as people do today. I prefer not to speculate too much about that at the moment. But I like to look at all the different theories. I don't like to have a very closed mind in this field.
Your research for this book, how long did it take, especially in order to notice or to decide on what was fake and what was real? How long did that research take?
It probably took around 2 years to reach a set of cases that we wanted to examine. Then after that, we were constantly refining it. In fact, the edition that's available right now in English that you can buy on Amazon, I don't recommend it because it contains cases that we have rejected since then. Cases that we've later discovered were not real or have been explained. But then there are a lot of new stories that we can add to this book. We wanted to bring out a new edition, a revised edition, but the publisher wasn't interested. But they still sell the book quite a lot. It was recently translated into German. So about 5 years later, we managed to get permission, because it's a question of copyrights, to get permission to make a special edition. And I'll show it to you. In fact, I have it here. The special edition is extremely big and horribly expensive, and I don't recommend it either. But anyway, this is it. Okay. I mean, yeah, it's I would recommend it as a guide to these cases. Because it is revised, it's corrected, it has a lot of very nice pictures. It's totally in color, and it's got all of the stories from the original one, then corrected. However, since then, I have also revised this constantly. So now my next big project will be to make a new edition of this. Probably for copyright reasons, again, I'll have to change the name. of the book. But the point is, this is an ongoing process. We're constantly analyzing, re-examining old stories, making the collection better, bigger if possible. And what do you do with all of this information when you have it? It's very difficult to know what to do with it. You have to read it, understand it, and also be willing to accept that if something is explained as a comet or as a meteorite or as a fantasy, that's fine. You accept it and you move on. The problem is these days, so many writers publish stories which were proven, which were demonstrated to be fake or misidentifications 20 years ago, 40 years ago, and they continue to recycle the same stories. You mentioned John Keel before. Well, I've needed to analyze a lot of his books and a lot of his anecdotes and ideas. Many of them were also fake. They're not true. He invented things constantly, and he got a lot of other things wrong. So we can't. I don't have any idols in this field because I need to continue researching everything that's been published so far.
Chris, in other book of yours, Return to Magonia, you revisit old cases with a critical approach, right? Did any of them change your view on the phenomenon?
Well, yeah, I also have it here. This is Return to Magonia, and I wrote this with a man called Martin Schoff. He has a strange name here. Martin Schoff. He told me, you can remember how to pronounce it because it sounds like fuck off. Anyway, he said that he would like to write this book with me. It's quite technical. It contains about 22 cases. And what we found was that there are many cases that you can analyze technically and reach the conclusion that they're very, very difficult to explain. When you use, for example, a digital observatory, so you can calculate the position of the planets and the stars, you're able to rule out the theories relating to the position of the constellations or the moon or the sun or Venus when you're looking at a case. We also get, I'll show you if I can. Here we have, for example, it's actually quite a deep and technical book, and we go into a lot of detail like this. And in 22 cases, yeah, there are several that are completely impossible to explain. And we really tried to find a scientific explanation for them. I'm not skeptical about the existence of UFOs because I saw one myself, but I am very careful about what we believe because there are so many people trying to make money from this and selling stories which are very easy to prove that they're not true.
Right. About another book, Alien Artifacts, it brings a historical perspective on how people came to believe in visitors from the stars. Do you think this belief was shaped mostly by people's experiences or by things they saw on the media or on books on folklore? What's your point on it?
Yeah, so the book Alien Artifacts, I'd been working on this for about 2 decades approximately, and I started looking at it because I was interested in stories that were published in the North American press, but not only North American, also French, Italian, Spanish, about meteorites that had landed with hieroglyphics on them. Or sometimes a meteorite that would land and they would open it up and find inside a statue, a book, or something else. And so I began, and this was 20-something years ago, I began thinking, but really, did people believe in these things so far ago in the 19th century, so far back? How is that possible? So I look back in time to find out when people first believed in an inhabited universe, a plurality of inhabited worlds. And I discovered that, people began to speculate about extraterrestrials on other planets in ancient Greece, because there's an ancient Greek school of philosophy and thought called atomism, in which they believed that the world was composed of atoms. And they were right. The problem is that they didn't have a microscope to prove it. And so they lost this theory. But part of the theory was that many worlds and planets in the universe were copies of each other, because atoms would generally form in the same ways everywhere, which would explain why no matter where you go on the planet, you'll see similar animals and similar rocks and similar people. So that they thought, well, in the universe, there are probably planets very similar to Earth. So it really started then. But then during medieval times, belief in aliens went down slightly because of Christianity and Catholicism. Then in the year 1277, theologians in Paris decided that it wasn't against Christianity to speculate about aliens in other worlds. So from that moment onwards, 1277, that's a very long time ago, it was popular to discuss aliens and extraterrestrials in the universe in many different parts of the world, including Japan and China, who didn't have the problem that Christians did at that time. And in any case, so they had the belief in extraterrestrial worlds. Then the next step was the belief in extraterrestrial visitation. And it was logical. If there were other worlds in the universe, then we wanted to contact them in some way. So we see a lot of stories, particularly in literature and fiction, also in songs and poetry and art, related to extraterrestrial visits to planet Earth. Then, starting from the beginning of the 19th century, around the year 1806, 1807, that's when people really began taking seriously the possibility that artifacts or people from other planets could come to visit Earth. Because they said, if meteorites exist, and meteorites were quite new at that time as a theory, if meteorites exist and they come from other parts of the universe, why not people? Why not artifacts from alien civilizations? So after that point, people were happy to talk about extraterrestrial contact on planet Earth. And that's when you find stories of this kind. And in fact, in 1823, that's 202 years ago, that's when we find the first book published about ancient aliens, the theory that our ancestors came from another planet or had contact with people from another planet that changed human civilization. And that book was published in 1823. And so I don't know what Brazil was like in 1823, but I can tell you in Europe, that's quite a surprising development for that time. And then throughout the 19th century, stories about UFOs and encounters became more and more popular. It was in newspapers, people found them constantly. You could have an author like Charles Dickens, for example, and he could pick up the newspaper and see a story about a UFO or about an extraterrestrial spaceship that had crashed. It's interesting how in the 19th century, people were talking about exactly the same things that they talk about today. Our ancestors were obsessed with aliens and UFOs. The problem is that all of this has been forgotten, and we are, in a sense, giving it a new life in the 21st century, like with your podcast. Well, you can imagine if podcasts had existed 150 years ago, for example, there were a lot of people talking about these topics even then. How many of those were true? How many of those stories about contact were real? Well, that's something that I'll have to let you decide for yourself. But it's very important to see that this has a very long tradition.
Yes, that's very, very interesting. And just for context, in 1823, Brazil had just become independent. Okay, Brazil became independent from Portugal in September 7th, 1822.
Wow.
So as an independent country, we had just started. And moving on a little bit, there's the Magonia Exchange project, right? There's this super fascinating initiative. It's like a collaborative network. How does it work exactly? What's the idea behind it, and what do you do?
Well, I started this in April 2003, so it's probably exactly 22 years old now. At that time, there were many groups on the internet. Of course, the internet itself was a new phenomenon, and people were creating social groups, research groups, and so on. Most of those groups have died over the last 20 years. Many of these groups, these collectives, they have a duration of 3 years, maybe 10 years if they're lucky. So the fact that mine has been going on for 22 is an achievement. Anyway, I began by contacting writers and researchers in the field, for example, Jerome Clark and Jacques Vallée, and said, why don't we use this new thing called the internet to share what we have? So we can exchange material, we can exchange ideas. It doesn't cost any money. And everything that we find from now on, we can share with the other people. The idea was that if you became a member, you had the obligation to share something. If you didn't do it, I would eliminate you from the group. So in a sense, I was forcing people to do this. And, you know, even 20 years later, it's not easy to get people to participate in this kind of thing. But I actually started one in Spanish around the year, I think, 2012 or something like that. It was okay at the beginning for 1 year, but most people say, I don't have time to scan a document. So I used to say, well, take a photograph with your phone. I don't have time to do that. What happens in the end is that in the English-speaking world, we get more and more and more and more information. And then the interesting thing, of course, is that using artificial intelligence, which is another area now I'm specializing in. I'm actually giving courses on artificial intelligence this year for the Chamber of Commerce of Madrid and other organizations. Using artificial intelligence, you can explore that mass of information to reach a conclusion or to do research. So now that AI exists and I have 60,000 items in all different languages, soon I'll be able to start processing all of that and reaching conclusions that would never have been possible before. So yeah, it's been a fun 20 years. Anybody can join if they want to contact me. The best way to contact me probably is either through Facebook Messenger, or just send me an email. You can put my email somewhere in this podcast, which is CAUBECK@gmail.com. And I'll send you an invite to the group. Doesn't cost any money. And these days, I'm not forcing people to share what they have. I'm more interested in having a collective to look at the information we already possess.
Bringing the conversation to Brazil and to Brazilian ufology, I want to know have you ever come across classic cases from Brazilian ufology, such as Operation Saucer or anything older than that? And what do you think about these reports?
Okay, so we do have some stories from Brazil in our archive. I don't know any offhand to talk to you about, but anything that we find, we added. Many years ago, I did a study of supernatural beings similar to fairies. What was the name of this one in Brazil? The Capuripa? Something like this. I don't remember the name.
Caipora?
That's the one, yeah.
Okay.
There were a lot of interesting stories about that. And these lights that go through the valleys and over the mountains, something like ouro or something like this, like golden lights.
Mãe do Ouro.
That's the one. And I also used to talk to Pablo Villarrubia Mauso, who lives in Spain, who writes books about Brazilian mysteries and ufology and so on, and his investigations of local legends. So yeah, I have a little bit of information, but one of my ambitions would be to collect more stories about specifically historical cases and add them to my collection or to my knowledge, so in the future I could talk about them. I don't know very much about early science fiction in Brazil, for example, from the 19th century, that talked about visitors from other planets. I imagine it existed because it was common in French and in other languages. And I don't know a great deal about Brazilian UFOs of the 19th century, but I'm very, very interested in, or 17th century or early 20th century. I want to continue building my archive. So when I analyze it, as I said, using AI, that sometime in the future, Brazil will be able to form a part of that study.
Right. During your research of this UFO imaginary, have you noticed any significant cultural differences between European and Latin American sightings? We talked about Brazil just moments ago. If for your knowledge of legends as Caipora and Mãe do Ouro, do you think there's a difference between what you see in other continents, not just cultural differences, but substantial differences in its how can I say, in its basis. The basics about it. There's something else in the world that you can't find a correlation to what you see in other parts of the world. Have you ever found anything like that?
Well, yeah, I mean, to a certain extent, because each country interprets these phenomena according to a mythological framework or a mythological system. So you do find, obviously you have more giants and hairy men and things like that in some Brazilian stories that I've seen in the past, which are quite interesting. Instead of the short-statured gray aliens that have dominated the West, well, the English and the American field since the 1980s. I think that some Brazilian abduction stories that I've read are slightly more, I don't know what I would call it, slightly more human, possibly. They don't seem to be as cold and distant, the aliens, as they are in British or American stories. Then there are certain things that get exported to other countries. For example, if you do find a story about short-statured gray aliens with big eyes, I can guarantee that you won't find one in Brazil from before, historically, they appeared first in American or British studies or literature or cases, because generally that's the way this works. They appear in one place and then are transposed to another place via TV and magazines or movies. So there's a lot of this kind of cultural exchange. I'm also interested in this linguistically, because I remember reading in one of Pablo Villarrubia Mauso's books that he's talking to someone, I believe it was Brazil, I could be wrong, but the main thing is the witness said that he saw, well, I think a man said he saw a dragon, and his wife said, no, it was a ball of light. So it's very interesting to see how one person can use an expression to describe what they saw. Another person who saw exactly the same thing uses a different expression. So over a period of time, you have the creation of legends and stories, maybe two different branches. In one, it will be about balls of light, and in the other branch, it'll be about flying dragons. So that's why linguistically it's important to be aware of this kind of phenomenon, how one person's interpretation or language might affect how a story begins to grow. It's a very complex subject. Unfortunately, I don't know enough about Brazilian ufology to comment that I want to change that.
We think that many Brazilian ufology is very big. We have many cases, and because the country is so big, just our folklore is very different from one region to another.
Right.
It's a very rich segment to study.
Yeah.
I would like to ask you another question. But just telling one thing, Eduardo asked you about differences between European and Latin American sightings. You talked about a more human touch in the reports.
That's the impression that I get. Yeah.
Yeah, but one thing that we say a lot here in our podcast and in our conversations, that the impression we get is that in Latin America and in Brazil in specific, we have many violent cases, aggressive. From the chupacabra cases, from another cases where the witness was shot by a beam of light and died after a few days, weeks, or months. This is an impression we have here, that a part of our cases are more violent and aggressive than in other regions, not just in Brazil, but in South America.
Now that you're describing it like that, that rings a bell. I'm remembering about the chupa chupas or something like this in the jungle.
Yeah, in the Operation Saucer.
And I remember a guy called
1977.
Jao Prestes or something like this, some kind of light. He was killed.
Yeah.
I do. I'm a little bit aware of that kind of thing. Yeah.
And just a second. As someone who studies historical records, have you found older UFO-related accounts in Brazil from before the modern flying saucer era?
I have. I mean, the only thing that I've found is some 19th century fragments, some stories, but I haven't found enough to be able to talk about them, unfortunately. And I don't know if that's a language thing. It might not be language. It might just be the availability of this information. I don't think it's been translated into English very often. What I find is that language isn't really a barrier, because I can read Portuguese, basically. I can read Italian. I can read French. The barrier isn't the language. It's the people. Because we have to express an interest in what other countries are experiencing. So, I don't have much to say about historical cases, but I would like to change that, as I said. So if anybody could guide me in that way, hopefully when I start publishing books on this subject in Portuguese, then people will contact me with their own information.
The first UFO related account we have in Brazil is from 1846. A captain of our navy, who was going from a province in the central area of Brazil, going down the Paraná River to I think Paraguay. And during this trip, he saw some lights in the sky. He was a captain of the Navy. He was an astronomer, so he made all the calculations. And his report was published on the official journal of the empire. Brazil would still be in an empire. So it's on the National Library in Brazil. But before that, we have some accounts, but they are all related to folklore beings. And it's still very difficult to find. There's a lot of work to be done, going to small libraries here in Brazil.
Well, the problem is the digitalization of newspapers. Because if I go on to, for example, newspapers.com, I believe there's about a billion newspaper pages that I can search as if it were Google. You pay a subscription and they give you this. But as far as Brazilian newspapers are concerned, I don't know what the situation is right now. Quite a lot of the big newspaper sites, websites, are in English, and it's because it's a big industry. It's they make money because there's a lot of interest in knowing about our ancestors and knowing where we are from, what happened in our families or cities in the past. So people are happy to pay money to subscribe to this service. Whereas in other countries, for example, in Spain, there aren't so many people interested in doing genealogical studies. So as a consequence, the number of newspapers is very limited. There are some very good websites, but it's not like in Anglo-Saxon countries where we have literally hundreds of millions of pages that we can search from the last 300 years. So maybe that would be difficult for Brazil to change unless there's some change in people's hobbies or cultural interests.
Just for context, especially for our international viewers, you mentioned João Prestes Filho. If you want to know more about that case, search for the Araçariguama. I'm also going to write it down. Araçariguama incident. Okay, it was in March 1946 when a flash of light burned a man from head to toe, but not his clothes, which was interesting. And then he died in a hospital like 9 or 10 hours later. So it's one of the most violent cases, I think, everywhere in the world. And Brazil has a lot of stories like that. The Chupa Chupa cases with Operation Saucer, usually people would have anemia after being hit by a beam of light as well. We also have the Barroso incident, in which a man had severe brain damage, and his mind and his behavior went back like if he was a child until the end of his life. And so there are many stories like these, and we have the impression that the portion of cases, violent cases in other places of the world, isn't as big as it is in Latin America, especially in Brazil, because, well, Brazil is most of South America, so it's also a geographic issue. But we are under the impression, at least, that in South America we have a bigger portion of violent reports.
Okay.
Well, after so many years of study, Chris, how would you define these phenomena? We usually say that the UFO part is just a piece of a bigger picture, and the phenomenon itself is bigger than that. But are we talking about something physical, psychological, cultural, or is it a mix of everything?
It's a mixture of everything, but it's the same even if you're just looking at meteorites. It's a mixture of everything. I think that some UFO researchers are embarrassed to think that there's a psychological component, a sociological component, etc. But if you look at any phenomenon, any natural phenomenon, we have the same thing. A solar eclipse, for example, is often seen as a warning of things to come in the future. Meteorites have been worshipped like gods in the past, and crazy stories have been invented about authentic meteorites. So what I mean is that in the world of UFOs, yeah, it's a mixture of everything. There's a lot of psychology. There's definitely a physical stimulus in many cases. But I mean, when we look in the sky, most UFOs, okay, what I want to say is that it's very difficult to find two UFOs that are identical, whether we're talking about a textual description, a photograph or a video, or a person's recollection. Generally speaking, two identical UFOs are very, very difficult to find. And when we do find stories of 2 or 3 identical UFOs seen at different times by different people, it's very exciting. And it's exciting because that's unusual. And that's a big clue that we probably shouldn't consider all UFO sightings to be of the same phenomenon. There's no reason to do so. I'm not saying that aliens are not visiting us. I'm not saying they are visiting us either. I'm not saying that that it's all in the mind. But sometimes I've said in a conference, I've said, well, you look in the sky, you see all kinds of different things, and for some reason you think it's all connected. I don't see any reason to believe it's all connected, in the same way that if you walk on the ground, if you look on the ground while you're walking through a city, you're going to find all kinds of things. You're going to find old chewing gums and cigarette boxes and everything. They're not all connected. This is it. I mean, you look in the sky, there's no reason to believe that all of these phenomena come from the same origin or are related in any way. The only thing that brings them all together is, humans. We associate anything in the sky with UFOs. That's why there are so many people who believe that if the gods were believed to be in the sky, they must be connected with aliens. Why? There's no reason for that at all. In the same way that, as I said, you look on the ground and you'll see all kinds of animals and pieces of paper, and they're not necessarily all connected. So I think that the main thing that we need to do, looking into the future, is to be aware of fake news, bad information, and try to get it better and better and better every time. As I said before, people like John Keel have only confused the field, because I've looked into many of his stories, anecdotes, book chapters, and found that it wasn't true, or he'd totally invented it or had misinterpreted somebody. We have to be very careful with information. We are being bombarded with more information than ever through the internet and everything that we consume. Of course, it's going to have an effect on our minds, and of course, it's very difficult to organize mentally and intellectually. We don't have time. The interesting thing about UFOs as a study is that it touches on science, psychology, sociology, anthropology, religion, linguistics. It touches all of these areas. And then if you want to, archaeology, history. One more. Probably swallowed a fly. So, one second. Anyway, so ufology, because it touches all of these scientific areas. On the one hand, it's extremely interesting intellectually, because suddenly we can become very knowledgeable about these different fields. And at the same time, we're incredibly confused by them, because not one person dominates so many areas. Theoretically, if UFOs are completely real and are a scientific manifestation of something interdimensional, you would need to be a quantum physicist to understand that. And very few ufologists have done a degree in quantum physics or physics in general. So this is the problem. It's how do you interpret so much data? You can't. One person can't. But that is also the reason why I'm very interested in using AI as a tool to help us interpret so much data in the future.
Okay, so we are, unfortunately, we're going to have to call it a day and land this plane. Chris has a class in a few moments, but sure, we would like to keep this conversation going in another opportunity. And of course, there's a lot of other interesting topics we would have we would like to cover. But we have covered a lot of interesting things today. Most of them, I don't think we would be able to cover with another interviewee. So, Chris, thank you very much for your time. Thank you for your attention and for accepting our invitation.
Thank you very much. I appreciate the opportunity. And another day we can meet and talk for several hours about so many different subjects. I'll let you know about what I'm publishing this year, and we'll see what I can get out in Portuguese too, in Brazilian Portuguese. And there are so many topics to look at, to be honest with you, that it's very difficult to condense them all. I mean, I've written other books that I haven't even been able to mention, like one that I'm going to reissue, that I'm redoing right now, is about crop circles, the crop circle phenomenon. Where I published this in the year 2015, I believe, and I'm going to do a new version of this now, of this book. And well, there are so many things. And one day we'll have to talk about Charles Fort. This is actually a proof copy with the font's wrong, and I changed all of this. I don't have my proper ones with me, my finished ones, because as I said, I'm moving to Cadiz next week, so it's all in boxes. But this guy is the the first American ufologist, I would say. He started the topic in the 1920s, and his books are very difficult to read. But I'm writing a synthesis right now of what he published, and hopefully I'll be able to publish that this year too. And I'm going to demonstrate that he truly was the first ufologist in history. So yeah, we need to talk. We have to talk about all of these things another day.
Chris, thank you very much for this opportunity. It was a very nice talk, and we hope we have another one next in the near future.
Yeah, I feel the same way. Thank you very much.
Okay, and we would like to thank you, the viewer, for staying with us all this time, and hopefully we will talk with Chris in another opportunity. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel, to like this video if you haven't already, and also to leave your feedback on the comments. We always read the comments in our videos, and we use them to improve our work. Anyway, so thank you for joining us, and we'll see you soon again.